Hello, I'm Bob Allen for Tree of Life Nursery, and we're going to talk about native plants and their pollinators today. Let's get started. All right, I'm the author of Wildflowers of Orange County in the Santa Ana Mountains with my buddy Fred Roberts. You might have heard of the book. A little overview of today, we'll ask why study pollinators, understand pollination, appreciate diversity of pollinators, and then really attracting and gardening for those pollinators. Well, why study them? Well, first off, numbers. It's amazing. There are 4,000 native bee species in North America alone. About 70% of those nest in the ground. Most are solitary. They don't live with any other bees. Nearly 25% of all bee species in the world face risk of extinction. That's not a good thing. So bees and other pollinators are essential to a healthy environment, yet they are declining. Around 85% of flowering plants, including many crops, need a pollinator to help the plant reproduce. As much as 1/3 of our food supply relies on the work of just bees, and there are more pollinators than just bees. And the pollinators are therefore at the heart of resilient ecosystems. Let's look at parts of a flower because you need to understand that in order to understand pollination. So let's start down here with the receptacle, the part where the flower attaches to the plant. The sepals, which form a structure around the rest of the flower called a calyx, so a sepal is a part of a calyx. And then petals are part of a structure called the corolla. And then we have the anther that kind of looks like two hot dogs on a stick. And that stick is called the filament. Inside the anther are grains of pollen. There's a drawing of pollen right there for you. And these two parts make up the stamen, the male part of a flower. In the very center, we have the top, which is called the stigma, which can be a structure or a surface. Next part, we have the style, kind of like a long neck. Styles can be a single one, like in this drawing, or they can be two of them that come out from the base, or they can come up and then branch out 2 or 3 times. They're very variable. On the bottom, we have an ovary, variously called a carpel for technical reasons. Inside the ovary, we have ovules, and that means, and there's an ovule there for you, that means that this is the female part of the flower called the pistil. Okay, the nectary down below, I drew that in a place underneath the ovary. Nectaries can be in all kinds of places. Often they're under the ovary. Sometimes they're on the outside of the ovary wall. Sometimes they're on the style. Sometimes up on the stigma. Sometimes on the petals, like it is in Mariposa lilies. Sometimes on the sepals. It varies a lot. So pollination, we need to really look at what pollination is. Pollination is just simply the movement of pollen to a stigma like this. Boop, we just saw it, pollination. So then germination, the next part, is when it grows what's called a pollen tube like this. It grows this tube out of the pollen grain down into the ovary to an ovule, and then fertilization occurs. And fertilization is when a sperm cell from the pollen grain down the pollen tube fuses with the ovule to make what's called a one-celled zygote, a new individual plant, which then divides its cells, becomes a structure we call an embryo. The embryo then lives inside of a seed. When the seed germinates and grows, it's a new plant. And that's reproduction of the species. So this all starts with pollination. Without getting that pollen to the stigma, plants can't reproduce. This is a wonderful photo of monkey flower pollen, showing the pollen tube growing out of some of these pollen grains. And the yellow are the pollen grains and pollen tube, and then the gray are little papillae, little tongue kind of pieces that are on top of the stigma in this plant. Well, we have several local pollen vectors. We'll look at these ones here, beetles. We'll look at flies, butterflies and moths, ants, wasps, bees, and hummingbirds. Beetles, these beetles, have chewing mouth parts. They eat pollen, they eat petals. As they wander around, they're very clumsy, and they'll knock into the pollen. They'll get pollen on their body. They accidentally transfer it to the stigma of another flower. They're great pollinators. They're not doing it on purpose, though. Here's a pollinator from Santiago Canyon. This is a blister beetle, and you can see all the wonderful yellow dots of pollen on its head, its antennae, its legs, its body. They just get it everywhere. This is another kind of blister beetle on California buckwheat. That's right, those little bitty flowers of California buckwheat look giant in a photo like this. This is a species of blister beetle who has developed this really long tongue, basically, or straw, if you will. Kind of thinks it's a butterfly, and it puts that tongue into the flower of buckwheat, for example, and drinks nectar like a butterfly. Here is everyone's favorite, the green fruit beetle. It flies around. Well, it's a pollinator too. It loves to eat flowers. It loves to eat fruit. While it's eating flowers, it transfers pollen from one flower to another. Here is a flowerfly. Now, flies usually go to shallow or tubular flowers where the flowers face up or out. They don't care about color so much, but boy, they like odors. If a flower has a sweet scent, a strong fruity scent, a thick perfume, or in some cases, dead animal carrion smell, flies will come to it. And every fly likes a different kind of scent. They don't all like the same thing. Primarily, we see flower flies like this fellow here, bee flies, and we see parasitic flies. These three are important pollinating groups here in Southern California. Notice how this guy here is just covered in pollen. He's just having a great old time everywhere. So next flower he goes to, some of that pollen rubs off and he pollinates it. Not doing it on purpose. He's just clumsy. Now, some people don't like flies. I don't understand, but they don't. Well, let's think about this. There's a little plant in South America called cacao, Theobroma cacao, and it's beautiful. It's got lovely leaves and flowers. There's that flower. It develops a wonderful fruit. You break the fruit open and it's got these fleshy pieces on top of each seed. You take the flesh off and you can see the seeds, and that's right, this is chocolate. And we grind up those seeds and make chocolate. Well, how did that flower get pollinated? You won't believe it. What pollinates this? Well, it is one genus of flies, very few species. They're all in the genus Forcipomaia in the Ceratopogonidae, a midge family. The chocolate midge is this one here. There's a few species that do this. This fly is so small that in the photo, you can see behind the fly, there's kind of a dark thing going up and down there. That's an insect pin. This fly is so little, you can't pin it with an insect pin. You have to glue it to a piece of paper and then put the pin through the paper. It's pretty wild. So next time you think, ooh, flies, well, do you say, ooh, chocolate? You can thank a fly. This is a local fly. I took this photo at Casper's Park one morning. There's a beautiful flower fly on coastal gold fields, major pollinator of this plant. Here are a couple flower flies in Mission Viejo on Baccharis. This was easy to take. I'm right by the sidewalk, so it's not hard to go find pollinators. They're everywhere. Just beautiful little critters. Look at all that pollen all over both of them. This is a Ceanothus that's at Tree of Life Nursery. I photographed this just walking by and said, oh, look at that beautiful flower fly there. So I took its photo. So Ceanothus is pollinated by flies and beetles and butterflies and moths and bees. Here's a bee fly. This group of flies kind of looks like bees, and some of them make a buzzing sound like a bee. Might fool you, but they eat pollen. Can't sting you, can't bite you. They eat pollen. Major pollinator, really important. Butterflies and day-flying moths. They have a tubular proboscis, like a big straw that comes out and goes into a flower, and they drink nectar. They don't eat pollen. The flowers usually are long, narrow, tubular, and have nectar spurs. Some of them have nectar spurs. They usually face upward, often colorful, definitely have a sweet scent in the daytime. However, these insects are not really good pollinators. Very few butterflies are effective pollinators. They're just not hairy enough. Where moths are very hairy, bees are very hairy. They're much more successful. Here is our state butterfly, the California dogface. There's a nice male up on top, and then on the left, there's a male with its wings closed, a female with her wings closed, nectaring from California thistle up on Majeska Peak in the Santa Ana Mountains. They love purple flowers. You can see their proboscis in the photo. They're pretty good pollinators of this thistle, but mostly these thistles are pollinated by bees. But if you provide the flowers, they're going to come. Here is the California tortoiseshell butterfly. These showed up at Tree of Life Nursery last year. I photographed them. And they're also pollinators. Now, none of these butterflies are major pollinators, but they try their best. But it sure is nice to see them. Here are a couple of painted ladies at Tree of Life Nursery. On that same Ceanothus, you can see their proboscis going into the flowers. I call this photo Lunch with a Friend. Here is a day-flying moth called the Western Snowberry clearwing moth up on Majeska Peak, and it hovers when it flies around. You can see that huge proboscis going into those flowers. This thistles, being a member of the sunflower family, have individual small flowers called florets. So this is not one flower, this is hundreds of little ones. As this moth came in, it flapped so much, it disturbed the native bees and native beetles, who are the true pollinators of this, that were down at the base. They all came up to see what's going on with all this commotion of these wing flappings. And then here, my friend Terry Hunnefeld took this photo out in Anza-Borrego Desert State Park. It's just a phenomenal photo of a whiteline sphinx moth in the daytime with its proboscis inside the flower, inside thistle sage, Salvia carduaceae. Oh my gosh, great photo. So Terry allowed me to use this. Just beautiful. Bees. Okay, now we're talking. These are the major pollinators. They have biting mandibles and a lapping tongue. They eat nectar, flat, bowl-shaped or broadly tubular flowers. They mostly go after most colors, however, not pure red, because to a bee, red appears black. And they're not attracted to black flowers. So if a bee comes to a red flower, it means the flower has perfume and the bee smells it and goes into the flower. Otherwise, they just ignore red flowers. They usually go after things with sweet odors in the daytime, and now they really are vital pollinators. Here is the Western honeybee, also called the European honeybee. It's not native to this country. It was imported hundreds of years ago. This pair of bees were feeding on two different plants, and the plants were next to each other at Riley Wilderness Park. Notice that the bee on the left has got on its back leg a bundle of yellow pollen from telegraph weed, that plant right there, where the one on the right was on doveweed, and it has that white pollen on its back leg. Turns out that when a bee wakes up in the morning, they actually make kind of a decision on what they're going to feed on that day. They go sample a couple of the plants around, gathering nectar, gathering pollen, and then kind of make a decision. This has been experimentally proven. They make a decision about what they're going to feed on the rest of the day. What was the yummiest snack for the amount of work they had to do? The bee on the left chose telegraph weed and stuck with it the rest of the day. The bee on the right chose doveweed and stuck with it the rest of the day. That faithfulness to one species of plant during the day is called pollinator fidelity. Well, look there, little white boxes. Out of the 20,000 species of bees in the world, you heard that right, 20,000 species of bees in the world, only one species lives in little white boxes that we make for them right here, these boxes. 1 out of 20,000. So the average person's perception of bees, I think, is based on a very small sample size. If there's 20,000 species of bees in the world, 4,000 in North America, then which ones live in little white boxes? Which are the ones you think are the typical biology of bees? Well, the genus Apis, all old world species, there's 7 species. There's 7. You only know the one. You know the European honeybee. There's 6 other species closely related to it that have different biologies. All other bees in the world then are not in the genus Apis. That makes 19,993 species of bees that don't live in little white boxes. In fact, more than that don't live in little white boxes. So here is the 7 species of Apis, and here is the other 19,993 species of bees that have a different lifestyle than the European bee and its relatives in the genus Apis. All right. So I've been asked a lot, are bees in trouble? And the answer is yes, they really are. There's a concept out there that we often call bee washing. The fallacious means incorrect. The fallacious idea that keeping or helping European honeybees will help the bees. No, it doesn't. Okay, think about this. The California condor is endangered, right? There's an endangered bird. How can we help that endangered bird? Well, keep chickens. That must be the way to help that endangered bird, right? No. So you wouldn't keep chickens in order to help the California condor. Just like bees. You don't help European honeybees and then think you're helping all bees. All right? That's something to really think about. Where do bees live? Most of them live in nests in the ground. Most kinds of bees nest in the ground like this. Look at that. What a perfect nest. Nice and circular. She's going to come back and continue digging that out till it's about ½ a meter to maybe 2 meters deep. That happens with a lot of species of bees. Okay, and again, most bees nest in the ground. Look closely. You'll see a bee right in the middle of the screen, and you'll see some little dark holes right about bee size to its left, straight down from it, and then 45-degree angle to the left, a little bit up to the left, 90 degrees, maybe a little more. Those are actually holes in the ground where the bees are nesting. They don't join their nests underground. They're totally separate. They're solitary, but these are bees that live in the same area. They found the same kind of soil with the same exposure to sunlight that they liked, and so they all made their nests there. It's not a colonial nest. All right. Now, again, most bees nest in the ground like these. These are Melisodes called digger bees because they dig a lot. This is the female on the right. Look at her, big fuzzy female. This is a male on the left. The males have longer antennae and they're a lot smaller. Females have shorter antennae, they're really big and have big furry back legs. This is a bee nest in the ground. This is a typical ground nesting bee. There are many species like Coletes in this case, where they dig a hole in the ground and they make these side chambers. They go out and they gather pollen and nectar. They make a little ball and put it in the ends of these chambers, lay an egg. When their young hatch, that one young feeds on that little ball, and then next year usually matures, pupates underground, and then months later emerges from that as an adult who crawls out and flies away. But they are solitary. No parental care here, just one bee per little chamber. So to get these, you want to clear vegetation from a sunny, well-drained area. All right, so if it's sunny, not a lot of water, just doesn't stand there. You want to have a little bit of plants gone from there. You want to select a site on an open south-facing slope because south gets the most sun. They want that nice warm sun. Leave some plants nearby to prevent erosion. You don't want to take all the plants out and then water comes through and erodes it all. So some plants need to be there. Don't turn the soil. That's so hard for gardeners. We want to turn that soil. We were all taught that in the 70s with organic gardening. Oh my gosh. Nope. Don't want to do that. Leave the soil alone. Let the bee do the digging. You don't need to do it for them. Bees need stable soil, soil that's not been turned. Leave it alone. All right, now some bees nest in wood like this. You can see this guy here, gal here actually, on the top center, goes along, lays eggs inside of some kind of chamber, provides with a pollen and nectar ball, just like the other one, lays the egg, and then cuts some leaves and put some, pack some leaves in after that one, another ball, lay an egg, pack some leaves, all right, another ball, lay an egg, pack some leaves. That's how they make that tube. Look at the very bottom. That's the completed tube. And then they emerge as adults, usually next year. It's kind of a typical life cycle for leafcutter bees, like in the genus Osmia. The adults are metallic blue, metallic green, and some are metallic black. This is a very common bee, and it could be you've not seen this before. This is Agapostemon angelica, the angelic metallic sweat bee. Look at that color. This is a male. Males have yellow and black striped abdomens in this genus. Females are all metallic green. Unbelievable. Just a beautiful bee. You can see it work in that flower. This is narrow-leaved milkweed. Here is Coast megachyle or leafcutter bee on Coast Goldenbush at Irvine Regional Park. Yeah, it doesn't have to be out in the wilderness somewhere. There's a playground nearby here. There's picnic grounds. This bee didn't care. He or she found some wonderful flowers of Coast Goldenbush and was feeding on it. Look at the pollen all over this thing. Now, this group of bees, the leafcutters, don't pack pollen on their legs like European bees and bumblebees do. Instead, they have these really stiff hairs on their belly, and they pack the pollen in there. So after gathering a lot of pollen like this, the bee will usually land on something else and sit down and comb its body and take its legs and pack that pollen underneath the abdomen into those hairs, those stiff hairs, and then take all that back to its underground nest or nest inside of usually some kind of a wood tube that it's drilled, or under bark very often. My friend Roger Renke in Tustin allowed me to show these. This is a great series of photos he took. This was in his backyard. He saw this Bogan Via with these perfectly round holes in them and said, aha, I know who's doing this. So he was very patient, and he waited, and the bee came back. This is a leafcutter bee doing the leaf cutting. So the bee's going to cut a nice round hole here to pack into their nest. Flies away with that piece. Comes back and cuts another one, and then flies away with that piece. See how it's holding it real tightly? It's bending up the leaf piece. It packs it into that nest and flies away. Thank you, Roger. What a great series. This is just a bee over at, I think this was at Tree of Life Nursery, just this beautiful native bee on Manzanita. Yes, Manzanita attracts lots of interesting native insects like bees and flies and butterflies. Here we have Nightshade. Now, Nightshade, related to tomatoes, has a really interesting pollination system. The pollen does not automatically come out of the anthers. It has to be coaxed out by actions of a bee, and only certain kinds of bees can do this. This also is true for tomato plants themselves. So here's a drawing of an eggplant flower. Eggplants are relative too, showing that the anthers are kind of tight. They're held against the style real tightly, like in this picture. In the drawing, they separated them so we can see them better, but the pollen comes out the tip of the anther only after the bee has done something very interesting we'll see in a minute. Here's a wonderful drawing of a bee shaking or vibrating. In this kind of pollination, the bee lands on the anthers and then is able to vibrate its wing muscles without flying, kind of like you would shiver on a cold day. And it sets up a harmonic, and the harmonic vibrates the anthers. The anthers are hollow, remember that. The pollen's just inside, they're loose, kind of like a pinball machine. And they set up the harmonic, it gets it going, and inside there the pollen gets energized and it's bouncing all over the place, and finally it reaches an energy level where the pollen just shooting all over the place, and finally the pollen hits the inside tip of the anther, and the anther opens up, it can't help it, and it shoots all the pollen out at the bee. Amazing to watch. Researchers up at UC Davis years ago figured out the force, a physicist there figured out the force that the pollen shoots out of these anthers. Now, first off, here on Earth, we are sticking to the planet basically by the force of gravity. We call the force of gravity on planet Earth 1G, 1 unit of gravity. Here, the pollen comes shooting out of the anthers at 25 times the force of gravity. That's right, 25 Gs are hitting that bee in the belly, and the bee just says, bring it. That's amazing. To simulate that, we would have to use a cannon and put it a couple of feet away from your belly and fire a cannonball at you and have it just bounce off like this does at the bee. We know that wouldn't happen. That would hurt you. So here's another illustration of this where the bee is on the flower, sets up this harmonic, gets the pollen moving inside the anther. There's a drawing of the anther there showing how the end of it opens up and shoots the pollen in the bee. And here is my simulation of this. You can do this at home very easily. You need a tuning fork, and it has to be in the key of middle C. Any music store can order this for you. Don't try other keys. Most music stores, all music stores I've been to, did not carry middle C. I had to order this. You have to get a middle C, and you strike it and hit the anthers of this nightshade, and this happens. There you go. See that pollen shoot out of there? Pretty amazing, huh? Okay, here is a European bee visiting Manzanita. Now, Manzanita has this buzz pollination as well. The only bees that can do this behavior are native bees like bumblebees, carpenter bees, leafcutter bees, some of the other we call common bees in the family Apidae, and some of the andreadid bees, the little skinny bees. And a famous bee that can't do this, cannot vibrate those muscles at all without flying, is the European honeybee. So what's it doing here? Why is it going to Manzanita flowers if it cannot retrieve the pollen? Well, it's hanging upside down there, putting its mouth into the flower, trying to get some of the nectar that's still dripping out of the flower. Because the bees that go in and do buzz pollination on these things kind of get that nectar going and the pollen going too. So this bee is after scraps. Essentially, because it does not pollinate or help the plant at all, it's stealing nectar. So we call it a nectar thief. Monkey flowers. Oh, who doesn't love monkey flowers? They have a very interesting pollination style. All right, so here they are. You can see the white stigma. They have two lobes up and down, kind of like you're going to catch a ball like this. All right, and that's what we really want to take a look at. Looking at a drawing of it, look at the upper left drawing. The stigmas open up like this, and the hummingbird comes in and pushes against the lower lobe of the stigma. And the hummingbird, if it's been on another plant, it's got pollen on top of its bill. So that pollen gets transferred to that stigma. Remember, pollen sticks to the stigma. And then as it puts its bill in farther and then uses its tongue to try to get some nectar, they didn't draw the tongue here, they just drew the bill. Then it makes contact with the anthers. So at the top drawing, it makes contact with the stigma and transfers pollen from another flower to this one, and then puts the bill in farther, hits the anther. The anther pops open and sheds pollen on the bill of the hummingbird. Meanwhile, the hummingbird puts its tongue in deeper and gets some nectar. They don't want pollen, they just want nectar. And then as they pull that back out again, they still get more pollen on that bill. Now they've got pollen on the bill, they go off to another flower and they do the same thing and they transfer pollen. So hummingbirds are very important pollinators of monkey flowers, as are large bees. They kind of do the same thing, except the stigma lobes whack the bee on the back of the head and also on the thorax and pick up pollen. This is a page out of my book showing the hairy bush monkey flower, Diplochus longiflorus, beautiful plant, grows in upper elevations of the Santa Ana Mountains, mostly north-facing slopes, also the north-facing slopes of the Chino Hills. Great place to see this. It is in cultivation. You could actually buy this plant, but they're nice and fuzzy and beautiful. They are pollinated almost exclusively by Allen's hummingbird, the world's most beautiful hummingbird. What a beauty. I wasn't able to get a picture of this. I've seen this in the Chino Hills, couldn't get a photo. So I asked David Sibley to paint this for me, which he did, showing you how the Allen's hummingbird is on hairy bush monkey flower. Again, there's just a reminder, there's the mechanism going on inside the flower. Okay, let's talk about attracting and gardening for your pollinators. Well, what attracts them? How do you get them in your yard? How do you get some butterflies? How do you get some bees and some flies? Well, visual cues is what they use. They're attracted to nice, pretty flowers like we are. The scent, they can smell. And then some plants have both. They have visual cues, they're very pretty, and also they smell good. And so the insects will come to them. If you meet something's basic needs, the B4, then it might come to your yard. So if you provide food for these beautiful insects, if you provide water for these insects, if you provide shelter and space for these insects, those are the three things that every species, every individual needs. And then mates for reproduction, that's a species need, not every individual needs to reproduce. But if these things are met, then you'll have these pollinators coming to your yard. You can take care of food, water, and shelter. They'll take care of the rest once the other individuals arrive. And I like to say that if you provide B4, they will come if they can. What do I mean by that? Well, if they're able to come to your yard, then they will. But if you live in downtown LA, just near concrete, or have an office building, probably not going to get pollinators coming to a garden there, no matter what you plant. Or if you live very, very high up, could be you won't get them. All right, let's talk about sizes. Something to think about. Most life on Earth is smaller than your pinky. That's right, smaller than your pinky. Most life on Earth, smaller than your pinky. Anything bigger is kind of uncommon, really. So looking at all the different forms of life on our planet, most things, pinky or smaller. So you really have to look for them. They're not going to come fly in your face and say, "Hi, I'm here." You have to go look for them. One thing to look for them with are wonderful binoculars. There's all kinds of great binoculars. I really like these, the Pentax Papilio. They are meant for close focusing. They see infinity as well, so they're good for birding and other wildlife, but they can also focus really close. And a great place to get those is a wonderful local store called Optics for Birding. They're online, and they're also walk-in store in Irvine, not too far away. So give them a call or dial them up on the website. But these are a great, great pair of binoculars. You might give these as a gift to somebody. These will last someone their whole life, and they can even hand them down. They're really good. They're very well made. They're a nice Pentax product. Pentax Papilio, I can't say enough about them. Now, there are two approaches to gardening or landscaping. A sterile garden, as I call it, versus a naturalistic garden. Well, in a sterile garden, you've got a bunch of non-native plants. In a naturalistic garden, you have beautiful native plants. In a sterile garden, you have non-native pests. Non-native pests? All these pests came from somewhere else. The pests you have in your garden, they're not native here. They didn't come from here. All the things that eat our food in farms and ranches, they're not native. They came from somewhere else. When in a naturalistic garden, you have very few pests, right? Very few pests there. Sterile garden, people use pesticides, which means you have a lot of death. You kill your bees, you kill your flies, your butterflies, your caterpillars, your beetles. They're all going to die. There's no such thing as a pesticide that only kills the good guys, only kills the bad guys, and leaves the good guys alone. It doesn't work that way. Where in a naturalistic garden, you don't use pesticides. You let everything live. In a sterile garden, you're doing mindless maintenance because you don't really care about that garden. You're weeding, you're taking out dead flower heads. That's called deadheading. You might have a lawn, which means somebody's doing a mow, blow, and go. Where in a naturalistic garden, you do some maintenance, of course, because gardening is awesome, good for you. Get outside, a little exercise. You're going to do some weeding, you're going to do some deadheading. But because a naturalistic garden typically does not include a lawn, there's no mow, there's no blow, there's no go. There's stay. People with a sterile garden, no connection to the land. I would bet if you go and talk to anybody, just look at someone who's got a non-native garden in their yard and go, what's that plant right there? They will not know. I know I've done this. Kind of annoying, but I do stuff like that sometimes to make a point. They don't know what's there. You ask them what a car they have, they know that. Why, I don't know. All right. We're a naturalistic garden because it's just really a part of nature. It's a part of you. You have a strong connection to the land. You go out there and you see that plant, like that thing's blooming now, or it's making fruit now, or look at that butterfly on there. It's just so awesome, really great. There's a strong connection to the land with people that have a naturalistic garden. A sterile garden, I say that because it's not used by other life forms. That's right. Nothing visits it. Go look at a lawn sometimes. You might as well have cement because a lawn doesn't support any living things except an occasional gopher, and you don't want those in a lawn either. So there's lawns and things like that don't provide habitat, which means there's no biodiversity. Or in a naturalistic garden, it's used by other life forms. You're going to find living things in your naturalistic garden. Lizards come in and they eat some insects. Caterpillars, butterflies, moths, grasshoppers, beetles. Oh my gosh, the list goes on. So other life forms will use that naturalistic garden, which means there's habitat there. There's biodiversity there. And you want that. In Flora magazine last year, I wrote an article about In the Garden. I love this title. It's really great. And so things I was asked would be, I've been reading about the insect apocalypse and declining butterfly populations. Why are native insects important? How can I support them in my garden? I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but I'll just hit a couple high points. Probably the main one is a garden full of locally native plants provides food and shelter for native insects. That kind of says it all in the article. So I gave them some photos of mine, red admiral butterfly and manzanita. They have to feed upside down because the flowers are upside down. It's always fun to watch them. A sphinx moth, the Achaemon sphinx moth, whose caterpillars feed on grape. There it is right there. Beautiful caterpillar, beautiful moth. Oh my gosh, big moth. Here's a wonderful grasshopper on California buckwheat. Here's a tree cricket on black oak. Here is a green grasshopper. This is a young grasshopper. I can't tell which one it is yet. It's too young, but it's on desert brittlebush. And then the upper right is a beautiful bumblebee on deerweed. These are all photos I took either at my house or very close to it. Took no work at all to take these photos. This is a naturalistic garden. You get all kinds of wildlife. Am I threatened by these things? No, not at all. If a grasshopper gets out of hand and eats too many leaves, you can put the grasshopper in a jar and take him out in the wilderness yourself and let him go. You don't have to spray something because there's a grasshopper in your yard. That would be terrible. Okay, so how can I support native insects in my garden? Well, locally native plants provide food and shelter for native insects. I think that needs to be like a mantra or a t-shirt or something. You need to use locally native plants. Eliminate pesticides from your garden. Reduce garden disturbance because pollinators don't like it. It really bothers them a lot. So you try not to turn the soil a lot. Yeah, if you've got a veggie garden like a raised bed, turn the soil as you need to. That's not the same thing we're talking about. It's not a naturalistic garden. Can you have a veggie garden in a naturalistic garden? Of course you can. You want to use mulch sparingly. So I say controlled use of mulch. If you're going to put mulch down between plants, usually to prevent a lot of weeds coming up, at least pull back the mulch in a few places, expose some bare soil, hopefully facing south, nice and warm, maybe on a little mounded spot so it doesn't catch too much water. And you will get some, you probably, no guarantee, probably get some ground nesting bees coming in there. I did this at Cal State Fullerton years ago. I was looking around near the art building, and there was this art display done with clay soil in bags, and they piled it all up. I forgot the name of the display, but it was back in the 70s, I think. And the bags had decayed, and the clay soil now was exposed, and native bees took advantage of it. There were hundreds of native bees nesting in this bank of clay there. It was fascinating. And then we need to change human notions about native insects. Because you have insects in your yard, in your garden, that's not a bad thing. It really isn't. It's a good thing. If there's no insects there, that means your yard is sterile. And that means there's something wrong, because 80% of the whole world is some kind of bug, whether it's an insect or an insect relative like spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites, those things. So about 80%. That's a lot. So they should be there, right? If they're not, something is wrong, and you need to realize that. If they're not there. It's kind of like being out in the wilderness and suddenly there's no birds. Something's wrong here. Maybe I should get out of there. My favorite pollinator plants: buckwheats, manzanitas, coast goldenbush, California lilacs, baccharis, California poppies, sages, beard tongues, monkey flowers, milkweeds, verbena, and all kinds of annual wildflowers. Those should be in every Californian's garden, period. No exceptions. We all should have these in our gardens. They're fantastic plants. They're beautiful, and they support pollinators. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Bob Allen for Tree of Life Nursery. You have a good day. Bye-bye.